Higgins.
Comrades and friends, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity of speaking to Labour youth. In fact, it is quite emotional for me in a way because I have so often spoken to Labour youth, and the circumstances may arise where in fact I may not be free to speak next year. I think that recently I was speaking in Kilkenny, in Inishtir, but before I say any more about Kilkenny, what a great pleasure it is that we're all meeting once again. Can you raise the podium, please?
Yeah, can you?
Can you?
No, it's just.
I think it's very important that we celebrate the fact that we're meeting in a constituency that is once again represented by Labour. The discontinuity is over. And I listen with great interest to what we've just heard as well, and we have been very well served by what you heard from Kathleen and Louise and Nash. But I am dealing with something slightly different, as I usually do at these Labour Party, at these Tom Johnson meetings. Over the years I've spoken about different topics, including the de-peopled economy. Surely it is a matter that all socialists all over the world must be concerned about. Is it a moral question? Can economics be ever made accountable? And you know, as I listened to some of the speeches here this evening, a thought occurred to me about the discourse in Ireland. And that is, even those who would like economics to be made accountable, who would like fundamental change, imagine that the first thing you do is that you beat up the Labour Party. And I ask myself, as a political scientist, sociologist, so old as the Freeze report on the Economic and Social Research Institute, how successful have radical commentators been on changing the Economic and Social Research Institute? How successful have they been in influencing any of the senior civil servants who take decisions in quite an administrative way to trouble the system? And yet this is something we have to get beyond, even in the Labour Party. The change that is required in Ireland, it won't come from us beating ourselves up, while we do have to face the questions that Kathleen mentioned. We have to address the wider issue of the consciousness in the society. You know, sometimes you get the impression, listening to some people, including those who write columns for the Irish Times, that the only thing stopping Ireland being a socialist society is the Labour Party. I say that as president of the Labour Party. And it really bothers me because I see something in it that really disturbs me. I say it as somebody who is an academic, who is a published academic, is that the papers aren't there, the books aren't there, the chapters aren't there. And in a way, while at the same time as people are hammering the Labour Party for not turning two conservative parties into socialist parties, you have people who are advancing clearly through the academic system, keeping a hierarchical system that the feudal system would be very proud of going, professorships, assistant professorships, associate professorships, fellowships, so forth. Enormous rituals, and I won't delay on this except to say is that the scholarly critique is at best evasive, and it is frequently cowardly. For example, in relation to the reforms of political science, I spent nearly 20, 30 years in that area. They rather cheap run in front of the mob in relation to closing down institutions, abolitionist theories, before one had the courage to critique the institutions themselves, such as the Senate and so forth, the number of councillors, the number of TDs or whatever. That was cowardly, because while a very long time ago, most of the political science, sociology departments, of which I was a member now, economics departments, are not really political science departments. They are actually descriptive forms of. Some of them have quite good and fine-tuned psephology, but few have political philosophy of the first rank. It is one of the great failures in Ireland, the failure in philosophy. I think then an issue which I think so much, may I say before I depress you too much, is that I get great energy from Labour Youth. I have people welcome me here, and people have said that, you know, how welcome I am again this year. It's so wonderful to see, particularly so many young women who are now in Labour Youth. And again, this issue is sometimes suggested as I listen to descriptive notions about what's happening in Ireland. You get the impression that we have evolved somehow, harmlessly and seamlessly, to a particular position, and that it's only a matter of describing things. Women were insulted, excluded. People who are same-sex people in relationships were excluded and treated disgracefully. Nothing happened by accident. It was all a struggle. I remember those early days in the 1970s, be it in relation to my own legislation trying to abolish the status of illegitimacy, those early ones in relation to the decriminalisation of relationships between consenting adults, be it in relation to family planning. The notion was, for instance, that we had to, somehow or another, we should creep our way in a republic towards some version of rights. I have, at this stage of my life, I'm 70, when I look back on my father's life in Ireland, in his two brothers and himself fighting for Irish independence in the Civil War, taking two different sides. My father in Newbridge coming out and being told with a sign outside the shop, there will be, and when this blackguardism is over, there will be no job for Johnny Higgins here or anywhere else for that matter. And he starts all over again. Now, we have had our version of a republic so firmly betrayed, but the scholarship has been weak, and the scholarship has been quite cowardly. I repeat again. And I think then, when I hear of it, I want to fine-tune that to a point. It has also been inefficient. The suggestion is that somehow or another, that through a kind of, supposing there are two different models that are quite different. One is kind of, there's always that Alistair McIntyre's notion that really it's all, politics is bad. People who are elected somehow or another are less efficient morally than others. So we could all start again in a communitarian way and sweep it all away. That would, of course, be a gift to those who want to manipulate the state and international capital and international investment. So communitarianism is worthy, but it's somewhat of a cop-out as a theory of change. Over on the other side, the ultra-left, particularly in upper-class universities in Britain and elsewhere, like the smell of the cordite, and they like Slavoj Žižek, and they say, we'll sweep it all away, and therefore the new terror will be what is necessary, if you like, to give us the new society that we need. And then you have those people who work every day, like Kathleen and Louise and Nat and others, who've had the courage to go to the heart of the machine. Now, I think, as I understand what Task is saying, for example, but I wish it said it more clearly, and I wish those on its board said it more clearly, and that is that democracy needs to be deepened and extended. Those abolitionists who are speaking loudly are not Democrats. The notion, for example, the notion that if you could get rid of a large number of TDs, if you get rid of councils and so on, you would somehow have it better. That argument was around just before the rise of Mussolini. And I think that people should want to just bear that in mind. The notion, therefore, and I disagree, if I might, with some of the presentations I've had. The arguments in this country are not managerial. They are not simply about efficiency. There are moral issues that are involved of a political kind. There are issues of political consciousness. And really asked myself much about this in relation to what is taking place. This is a splendid introduction we've had to this session this evening, and you will have more when you come in to discuss North Africa and the changes that are now taking place in the Middle East and elsewhere. Well, what is taking place? If you listen to the voices of very young, highly educated North Africans who are sweeping away different forms of authoritarianism, is not simply materialist. It is about emancipation. And this is one of the problems that the left has not perhaps checked, and it hasn't been served by the absence of political philosophy in Ireland, and I won't dwell in it, I spoke at length in Inish Tiuk about it, is that the radical impulse precedes any materialist socialist impulse. There were people who, and there are people today all over the world, there are women who look at their children and they want their children to live. And it's about food, it's about bread. There are others in Central and Latin America who are talking about titulos or titles to land that they might live. And that radical impulse is one about life. There are other people as well, for example, who don't regard it as emancipation to enslave yourself from the time that you are able to consciously work until you drop dead. There are people who want to think that emancipation is about the right to think. The emancipation is about the right to feel. The emancipation is about freedom of one's body to some extent. It is about the right to be able to engage with others, and so forth. And all of that comes out of ethics that precedes the period when Engels is interpreting Marx. I put a question in Inish Tiuk to some of my dear friends on the left, for example. What if Marxism was not only the only science? What if it wasn't a science at all? And then what are the implications of you accepting on the left a kind of linearity that suggests that you have to push yourself through the stages of capitalism to arrive at state socialism, and then you can begin to talk about feminism and about ecological responsibility and sustainability. The fact is, it is because we didn't on the left to some extent, pose the tough intellectual questions that people from the right were able to crow with hubris and say that in 1989, not that state socialism had failed, which was a fact, but that socialism itself had failed. So one of the great advantages of Labour Youth is its celebration of ideas. I hope that in the years to come, that it will open always with nearly all the parliamentary party present. I wish it did, because I think that one of the lessons we have in the history of socialist theory is very much the one that the right can manage without ideas. The left cannot manage without ideas. And if you take, for example, if you take what we have just heard in relation to, for example, deregulation, it happened in a sinister way. Very few people realize that it was President Clinton who, if you like, eventually capitulated to a long campaign for amendments to the Glass-Steagall Act that released trash bombs around the world. This had gone on since they never had the courage, nor did they need to say, we want to lift regulation. They kept coming with amendments. And eventually, under the appalling advice of Greenspan, President Clinton concedes and allows, if you like, trash bombs to go all over the world. Now, there's no point in saying that the problems in relation to Ireland or elsewhere all over the world have nothing to do with that it is a matter of efficiency. It is indeed important that we spend every penny well and efficiently, but it is also important that we exercise our minds to see the alternatives that are there. And they're not alternatives defined within the narrow spectrum of any neoliberal economy or adjustment. You know, writing about the left and socialism, there's always a lovely question that arises, and this is one that young people particularly should ask. And that is the urge to socialism on the left, is it something that is instinctual, or is it something that is out of reason? There's a long tradition of left-wing Marxist writing that suggests, well, really socialism is the most rational way of organising one's life. it can become very tedious. And I have spent a long time listening to many, many tedious speeches about people who have suggested that you must be efficient in a materialist sense before you have the right to breathe. And at the same time, all over the world, people like Pablo Neruda, Victor Jara, and in Africa, and writers, are singing out about the celebration of life that is involved when you are free, when you are emancipated from economic slavery, emancipated from need and from so forth. So there's a lot more to it than that. So I think, therefore, in relation to celebration and its importance in relation to the left, a lot is about the discourse that you have. What are we free to talk about? Now, a few astonishing facts. We're in a republic, and the conversation you have heard tonight cannot be heard in any media outlet in Ireland. There is no possibility that the national television station will ever have a discussion like you heard this evening. In relation to the ownership of the newspapers, a very small truncated version of it may ever appear. That is one of the reasons I have to tell you later why in 2004, and now 7 years later, I have decided myself to try and introduce this conversation around the country. I am radically speaking about a form of citizenship that is radically inclusive, very different from the radical individualism that brought us where we are. In a creative society that is not only about aesthetic creativity, but it is about how people adjust their time and their lives and their emotions to take care of other people, for example. How we use creativity in relation to defining really a creative community that can in turn have a sound basis for creative industries and so forth. And then I say that it is when you're doing that, you're talking about building a real republic that isn't about territory only, but about dignity. The radical republicanism that is involved when you look at the other person, you realize that it is socially together we all develop, and you take that dignity as the inviolable principle, irrespective of means, capacity, and so forth. That is what we're talking about. Now, to have the courage to do that is very different, for example, from simply saying that, well, what we want of Labour is, yes, Labour is always in difficulty when it goes to the centre of the machine, but it is a courageous decision by Labour people who try to work and deliver as much as they can in the short term, often simply protecting vulnerable people. But also I think it is important for us to realise that parliamentary democracy is one part of democracy. We need to deepen democracy. We need to extend democracy. But how in the name of goodness is that helped by those who are making that argument, turning and pointing their finger and saying, in the first instance what we must do is in fact get rid of some of the people who have the disadvantage of being elected. So I say to them in many cases, put your money on the table properly and say, for example, if you want to deepen democracy, come to meetings like this, and then have the courage to say to the national broadcaster, why aren't you having this kind of discussion? You say to the people who own newspapers, is it casual that one small number of people will own all of the newsprint? That's what a democracy is. That's what a republic is about. I think there is something that is very interesting that I've often spoke about when I last spoke at Labour Youth. I spoke about Ernst Bloch, about, if you like, that vision that is there in the politics of hope. I think there's the conclusion. In the end, when he places his faith, if you like, on an inevitable Marxist success, which is, I think, a mistake. We speak about utopianism. How do we live? For example, if you take even the writings of Saint-Exupéry or whatever, you look at a child there. If you don't believe in a different world, that a different world is possible, do you say your position is inevitable? You are the children of serfs. You are the children of those who must be peasants. Or do you say you should have in a society the opportunity of expressing your individual, your personality to the full? And then you look at, for example, the kind of nonsense that is going around. Where I am actually, everyone in the world knows the date of my birth on the 18th of April 1941. But I have been answering questions to people. Are you too old? how is it Republican to say to some people, are you too young in a republic, or are you too old? That is what I mean by saying is that in a society that respects the decencies, with the most minimal requirements of the left, you have to talk about intergenerational responsibility. You go on through life, from the very small point of when a child goes to schooling for the first time, to the very end of life, where I was at many of these festivals about Bealtaine and so forth. And the notion, what are you to say to older people who are in nursing homes? And you say, aren't you mad to think that you can paint? Aren't you mad to think that you're able to listen to music now? And why aren't you dying fast enough? This is really the agenda, the vicious agenda of ageism in this country. And then again in a republic, if those of us who are sociologists know the facts, why have we allowed what has happened in the travelling community to continue? What about, for example, all the terrorism that is being raised in schools that is based on homophobia? Why is it that young males, for example, are committing suicide at 4 times the national rate in certain areas when we know the reason is that? And why then, for example, are our people who have responsibility for scholarship not asking the question, indeed, that Connolly asked in many cases, is it possible to lay the agenda of nationalism alongside the agenda of socialism, and who will win, and so forth? People think that Connolly did not ask that. Indeed, he did in his writing. So therefore, it is so important to have ideas that matter. And I think that in my own travel around the country, I hope I will be able to draw on your support as we encourage the discourse that is sufficient, the discourse that will bring us to a new place, a journey that we will go on together. And it will include people of any gender, people who have their own choices, people of different ages, people of different backgrounds, and that's as it should be. That is as it should be. But the left needs to be an intellectually confident left. And the left needs to be careful about the language into which it may frequently be seduced. Let us say one word. For example, my dear colleagues in the trade union movement sometimes use the word partnership. My friends in the community and NGO sector use the word partnership. People say we're all partners. Well, I've seen this partnership. It means that the so-called director of services in a local authority arrives with a decision taken, he turns it upside down, he allows them to blather on for an hour or two, and then he tells them what has been decided in the first place. That's not partnership. Partnership is when you go to something which has an open discourse and options that are different are possible. In exactly the same way, when you find in relation to this issue that I'm simply saying that the themes that will be part of our debate over the next year, it is time we debated, if you like, citizenship and what do we mean by inclusion? Is inclusion simply toleration? Is inclusion, for example, in relation to the enormous debate we've had about sexuality, where people say, well, you can get on with that in your own time, but kind of keep it to yourself. Now, the fact of the matter is, we either are genuinely aspiring to live in a republic with an inclusive citizenship, and also, as well as that, we also, in relation to our creativity. Creativity is not only, as I said, about art, it is about cooking and craft and making things and so forth. And when I go all around the country, as I have for the last 9 months, when I see the wonderful things that are happening, there's excellence everywhere. If we were dealing with, for example, in that last period I was in the Dole, if we were dealing with deficit issues, we would deal with them within 2 years or whatever. But we should be let it, you will never, when did the Irish Times last publish the fact that the unconditional guarantee had a vote of 124 votes to 18, and that the 18 votes were from the Labour Party? It's as if suddenly, we were all suddenly part of this. We were not. And it was in the middle of the night, some of us made the argument that that albatross, which is an albatross around the neck of a future generation, was agreed by a consensus among everyone other than Labour, including Sinn Féin, who said this is in the national interest, and the phrase was used, I'm coming to it, the phrase was used, about putting on the green jersey and in the national interest. We now have to move past any recrimination, but we must do so with a respect for intellectual work. Labour parties all over Europe and in the world sometimes lose energy, and they do so when they stop respecting ideas. We need ideas now. We need ideas all to make, for example, taking Louise's final point, if you are going to have a form of globalization that is a genuine realization of our interdependency, and that is driven by a kind of an ethics of trade and so forth, it means we must do that kind of work. Our problems are not only administrative. Our failures in the country, for example, are certainly at the level of consciousness. They're at the level of legislation. I'll give you an example of what happens then. We sometimes thought when the Equality Act was passed that we had won. But it was equally important to look at the administrative structure that was going to deliver equality. So you have to drive on with consciousness to changing the administration as well. That's why you had the Equality Authority damaged, Combat Poverty damaged, and so forth. Because we allowed that great nightmare that Max Weber wrote about, that kind of iron cage of bureaucracy, to defeat us even when we were winning at the legislative level. That's why democracy is more than about the Dáil and about parliamentary democracy. It's about changing the way we administer. It's about changing the way we speak to each other. It's about the way we listen. That's what democracy is all about. But I think that people, as I've often said, when I come to the Tom Johnson School, I'm always I was so pleased when it was Labour Youth took up the phrase, proud to be Labour, proud to be left. And I think that that is just so important. I think as well, and it's my wish for all of you here, is that there be an integration of your lives and history in that way, so that you can seize your history. Next year, the Labour Party will be 100 years old. There were people who were faced with incredible problems. Farm labourers trying to organise the Rural Workers' Union, for example, who are not allowed to eat at the same table in the same room as some of the large farmers who hired them. And yet they went on to be Labour. They held their own belief that one day this will be different, in exactly the same way as many people in the United States saw that that kind of discrimination would end, as Martin Luther King said. They had seen the different land in precisely the same way. All those people who are here, those young people, they must see the different society. And as I have so often said, as Raymond Williams wrote, it is when you have in fact questioned the inevitabilities that you have taken your first step in a journey towards hope. I also think that finally, that in relation to other matters about the left itself, the left needs to be original, not simply just only flexible. It needs to be original and creative. It is informed by, as I said, that moral instinct. It is there in the writings, in the songs, and so forth. People who had never read Marx sang songs against landlords. People who are, in fact, actually talking like Victor Harati, wrote in different ways. And you have also to be open. For example, in all the different countries that are changing place, be it in Algeria, be it in Morocco, or be it in Tunisia, or elsewhere. One of the things that was interesting about the old 18th century and imperialism, it justified imperialism by saying that the places where they went were in fact lesser people. You could say as well as that they couldn't be rational. So you had first you said that they are a subhuman. Next you said that they are not using the land is an empty land. And then you said they're not using the land properly like we would. And thus you justified it. It's very interesting when you take Denis Diderot's work writing about this in the 18th century. What does he describe it as? He describes it as a tiger gone feral. He said at home they are restrained. But when they go abroad near the equator, it's as if every inhibition was thrown off. That is precisely, this world is ending. A new world is being born. This world is happening all over the place. Economics will be different. But there's no point in somebody who's a radical economist coming and saying, well, I'm going to make my living within the orthodox economy and the economists in the academy. And I'm going to go to the Labour Party then to have a lash at them because we haven't a socialist society. The place for them to have their courage is in the departments in the universities. And they need to demand their papers. And they need to write the books. And they need to stand up on stone walls once again and speak about that alternative. Then you will make a change. The discourse is important. But maybe there is another way that they're doing it. What they do, the usual ways I had for myself, as I said, as a writer, and I would say this, is that maybe you could have it this way. You would just have a few glasses of red wine and feel guilty every couple of times a year. This is a time for membership. It's a time for recruitment. It's a time for activity. It's a time for that what was then in Connolly. It is time to link political thought with political activism and with moral instinct. It is also important to realise that it is not simply by material things alone that we live. In every one of those countries, some of which believe, for example, that their rights are in fact an achievement of rationality. There are hundreds of millions of people who believe that their rights are revealed. So therefore, the cultural agency that differs within our own society and across different societies must be respected. It is that, if you like, the left's agenda is being reforged and remade. At home here in Ireland, we are in a wonderful space. It's as if we can shape it any way that we wish. We do that by driving on our ideas in a discourse, discussing, as I've said, citizenship, creativity, inclusion, all of these things, radically expecting dignity, and having a society that welcomes people, and being generous, and recognising difference for what it is, and putting an end to the fear and the ignorance and the prejudice that excludes any member of our society here or abroad. It is a very great experience if you don't do it like that. I have, as I end, to say this. I was closely associated with many of the people who developed Sandinismo in Nicaragua as an alternative to the dictatorship of Somoza. I would say this. It was precisely because bureaucracy was not critiqued. It was precisely because, if you like, the voice of the people as a continuous agenda of inclusion was not respected that the revolution deteriorated. All over the world, change is taking place. We make our own change. And that inclusion that I speak of will also be one of, for example, listening to the stories and the narratives of all those who have come to live with us. And for respecting the Irish language, for respecting all sorts of languages. But the most important thing I would say is this. Sometimes, in the worst times, in, for example, the neighbouring island, when I look at the British Labour Party and I think of my many, many friends in it, it was an easy thing to suggest that you must do something, that in order to do something new, you must break your connection with the past. It is a great and tragic error. We must remember why we came to be where we are. We must equally then, as a great liberation, as an emancipation, say, there is nothing we can't imagine for us all together in a sustainable planet living in peace. Thank you very much.